Welcome, everyone. Um, Welcome. This is the Green Party Trade Union Group's AGM for 2024. My name is Robert. I'm the chair of the group's committee. It's really good to see everyone. Thank you all for joining. So if you're new to us, we're the home for trade unionists, allies, and supporters of the labour movement in the Green Party of England and Wales. We believe that a powerful, organised labour movement bringing together millions of working people is essential to transforming society for people and planet. And that's a task that is as important now as it was when GPTU was first set up, which I actually only found out at a conference. It was 30 plus years ago. I think it was someone I spoke to who said that they'd joined in the mid 80s. They joined the party in the mid 80s and said that the Green Party Trade Union Group was already active then. So I didn't realize that. So we go way back. But now more than ever, with the shift to the right from Starmer, the role of connecting the environmental movement and Greens, elected Greens, especially with the labour movement and with trade unions is just so important. So hopefully you and you're all here, you know that. But yeah, it's really exciting to have you all here and to talk through what our plans for next year should look like and how we deal with the political situation in front of us. If it doesn't feel like a year since our last AGM, don't worry. The last one was actually in February, so that was a bit late. We're back on schedule now. We did recently have we had nominations open for our committee. Voting for the committee for next year will open very soon. We're just trying to get that sorted out. And I'll be reporting on all of the activity that we had this year after the discussion. So yeah, really keen to have your ideas and thoughts on what we should be doing as a group next year. But first, I'll pass to Jane Baston, who's our Media and Campaigns Officer, to introduce our excellent speakers.
Thanks, Robert. And yeah, thank you all for coming. We're very excited to be joined by two fantastic speakers this evening. So we have Grace Blakeley and Zack Polanski, and I'm going to hand over to Grace in a minute. But before we get started, we are going to be doing a Q&A after both Grace and Zack have spoken. So if you want to ask any questions, you're welcome to stick them in the chat and I'll collect them together. But people are also welcome to put their hands up at the end as well. If you want to ask a question, I will ask that you ask a question and not make a comment. If you want to make a comment, you're welcome to put it in the chat, and we can chat as we go through. But there will be space at the end for any kind of questions that people have for Grace or Alex. Not Alex. Why did I say Alex? Zack, sorry, my brain is in like 4 different spaces tonight. Anyone who's ever done a 60-second survey, I'm right there with you. I'm going to hand over to Grace to get us started. So Grace, over to you.
Thanks so much, Jane. And thanks, Rob, and everyone for being here tonight. It's great to be able to talk to all of you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the ideas in my latest book, Vulture Capitalism, and how they relate to some of the, I guess, like challenges and opportunities that there are when it comes to trade union organizing at the moment. So part of the reason that I decided to write this book was out of the recognition that a lot of people in our economy and our society today feel very, very powerless. There is this kind of deep and pervasive sense that, a lot of people have where they don't feel like they're able to kind of, affect change in their own lives, let alone in the wider world. I think a lot of people are weighed down by the weight of a lot of personal problems around the cost of living crisis, around poverty, inequality, insecurity that feel kind of unsolvable. And that even doesn't even mention kind of all of the bigger, more systemic problems that a lot of us are aware of, whether that's kind of geopolitical conflict or climate breakdown. So many of the issues and challenges that we face both on a daily basis and when we think about the state of the world seem just so massive that we feel kind of really powerless in thinking about how we could be able to deal with them. And I think that, a big part of the reason for that is that the way we think about politics and the way that we're supposed to deal with these problems is fundamentally broken. What I say in Vulture Capitalism is that we're told we live in a free market society, and actually capitalism is a kind of substantially centrally planned system. So we're told that we're kind of free to make the kind of decisions that we want, to work wherever we want, to consume whatever we want, and that freedom is the kind of foundation of free market capitalism. And actually, capitalism is a system not based on free markets or even democracy. It's a system based on kind of profound concentrations of power. So, big, powerful, monopolistic corporations not respecting free markets and instead working with financial institutions and powerful governments to basically determine who gets what. So there's this kind of juxtaposition, this tension between the idea that we're free, that we live in these kind of decentralized, free market, democratic systems, and the reality of this system of basically kind of capitalist central planning, this, pretty authoritarian and centralized system where a few people, the heads of the biggest corporations, financial institutions, and politicians get to make decisions that have massive implications for the lives of everyone else. And that kind of is, I think, a really significant part of a lot of the political challenges that we're facing today. Because, the idea that we're all free to kind of create the conditions of our own existence was the lie that we were sold in the 1980s with the kind of neoliberal turn. This was, Thatcher basically coming in and saying that she wanted to kind of deliver people from the oppressive weight of the state, create free markets, decentralize power. And actually, the economy that we got as a result of those free market turns wasn't any more free market. In fact, it was characterized by much greater levels of oligopoly and monopoly power. And it certainly wasn't more democratic. We actually had a kind of centralization of power. And even, when we think about the size of the state, we are often used to thinking of neoliberalism as something that's about shrinking the state, but that's not really true. State power is, as any protester, anyone involved in the miners' strike, anyone who comes up against it will know, is pretty substantial, pretty brutal. And equally, the state is very powerful when it comes to doing things like bailing out the banks or providing support to big businesses and big corporations. So, we were sold this lie that neoliberalism meant free markets, it meant democracy, it meant kind of shrinking the state and replacing that with individual freedom. When in fact, what it's really meant is the kind of capture of the state and the centralization of the economy. An example that I really like to use to illustrate this is the example of Boeing. So some of you guys may have seen that Boeing's been in the news recently. A couple of planes went down when the doors fell out of the planes mid-flight. Those were kind of, relatively like small on the broad scale of things, challenges that the company faced, especially when you think back to 2018 and 2019, when you had the 737 MAX disasters, when two Boeing planes fell out of the sky, killing nearly 350 people. It later transpired that senior executives of Boeing had known about these problems and had let the plane go to market anyway. The company was being regulated through the philosophy of kind of self-regulation. So it was being regulated by a unit of the Federal Aviation Authority that sat inside Boeing and whose workers were being paid by Boeing. So there was this massive conflict of interest there, and the FAA didn't pull it up when it was required. So it would be easy to look at this and think, right, this is a classic case of corporate corruption, of a lack of regulation of a small state, whereas actually the American state was behind Boeing the entire time. It had given it tons of corporate welfare, of subsidies. Even after Boeing was accused of a criminal conspiracy to defraud the United States, it got a massive backdoor bailout during the COVID-19 pandemic. And indeed, it's a huge part of the US's military industrial complex. So what you see there is this kind of deep, pervasive collaboration between powerful executives in this big aviation firm and politicians within the state in the pursuit of generating as much profit as possible for the owners of that company. The unionists and the workers who'd come forward and said this plane is unsafe were completely ignored and pushed to one side. I think that example really shows why this sense of powerlessness is so genuine and so real and so pervasive. It's because, as an individual worker, as an individual citizen, you come up against these like matrices of entrenched corporate, financial, political power. And they're so often used to disempower workers and to kind of strengthen the inequalities that exist within our societies and to basically allow big corporations and powerful institutions to get away with whatever they want. Part of the reason that I wanted to kind of bring this set of ideas forward was because I think it's really important that anyone on the left doesn't just think, as I think historically has been the case, that the only thing that is required to kind of make the system fairer is to reverse that like small state neoliberalism and make the state bigger. And I think this has been a trap that we've often gotten caught up in because we oppose austerity, because we oppose cuts that are going to harm working people. We end up in this cul-de-sac of basically saying to people, well, if you just kind of vote for this political party and trust that the politicians will do good things for you, then your lives will improve. And that obviously isn't a particularly compelling offer to people who are not only used to being lied to by politicians, but to people who know very well, even if, they couldn't actually kind of label all of these examples, that most of the time big businesses and powerful politicians are working together to kind of make the system function more effectively and to screw over workers much more than they are to actually help workers. So, is it any wonder that when you kind of frame politics in those terms, it makes people feel powerless? So the reason that I wrote this book was to say, right, if we know that capitalism isn't really a free market system, it isn't really a democratic system, there isn't this separation between politics and economics that we think that there is usually when we think about capitalism, how can we start to combat those inequalities of power? So there's a kind of third force really in society, which isn't market, it isn't the state, it's popular power. And the example that I like to contrast with Boeing, is that of Lucas Aerospace. So Lucas Aerospace was a company in the UK in the 1970s, and it was under threat of closure, basically because of rising competition from abroad. And the workers at Lucas Aerospace went to Tony Benn, who was then the Minister for Industry under the Labour government, and said, we need you to nationalise us. And Tony Benn said, no, we can't nationalise you, but why don't you go away and come up with a plan to kind of save this firm? So at first the workers were pretty skeptical. They kind of, weren't really sure that this was something that they would be able to get off the ground. But they did ask all of the workers in the company. And what they got back was this kind of astonishing array of ideas as to how they could transform this company and not just like bring it back from the brink of collapse, but also instead of producing weapons, which is what Lucas was producing predominantly at the time, reorienting it towards the production of socially useful technologies. And this movement for kind of socially useful technology and for democratic ownership and kind of people power, I guess, was really kind of kicked off by this plan that was developed by Lucas Aerospace. It was greeted this plan when it was put together with kind of shock from across the political spectrum. Even like, the Financial Times was saying this is an amazing thing to have achieved. An MP stood up in Parliament and said, this kind of really cuts to the core of the capitalist model, because the capitalist model is the managers make the decisions and the workers just obey. But this was an example of workers actually taking control of the institution in which they worked and saying, we think we could do things better. We think we could do things differently. And the plan that they came up with was pretty remarkable. What's really interesting about the response to the Lucas plan is it kind of shows us what the whole like free market turn was really about. It wasn't about freedom or free markets. It was actually about crushing that kind of popular power that posed a real threat to the interests of capital. So when Margaret Thatcher came to power, she, basically like crushed the Lucas plan. Lucas was carved up in the shareholder value revolution of the 1980s, closed down. Bits of it was sold off to loads of other companies. And ultimately, I found during my research that parts of what was once Lucas Aerospace were bought by the company that manufactured the faulty sensors in the Boeing planes that crashed in 2018 and 2019. So that was really the two paths that we faced as an economy, as a society at the time. It was basically not a choice between neoliberal free markets and a small state on the one hand, and then a kind of big overbearing state on the other hand. It was a choice between this kind of centralized nexus of public and private power in pursuit of profits versus people power. Now, obviously, we know that the kind of corporate power won in the 1970s and 1980s. And, there were lots of reasons for that, not least the fact that so many people were taken in by this argument, which was that if we kind of create free markets, it will make everyone feel more free. But there's another really significant shift that's helped to embed that. And this is something that I'm writing about at the moment, which has been the shift towards individualism. So from the 1980s, it wasn't just that the whole economy was changed to kind of undermine the labor movement and strengthen the power of big business. There was actually a whole swathe of social and political and economic reforms that were introduced designed to make us feel like we were all kind of isolated, atomized individuals who had to compete with one another rather than cooperating to change things. And that was a really significant shift that came with neoliberalism. People stopped seeing themselves as workers. They started seeing themselves as investors. Instead of citizens, we were consumers of public services. Instead of communities, we were households. We were really encouraged to basically compete with one another rather than cooperating. And you see this today with like the decline of the labor movement, and particularly with what's happened during the cost of living crisis. Back in the 1970s, there was a cost of living crisis then, also driven by an energy shock that drove up prices across the whole economy. And workers responded to that by coming together and demanding wage increases in line with inflation because they could do that. Today, there have been a much more kind of individualized response to the cost of living crisis. Instead of coming together and demanding a kind of collective response, demanding a shift in the way the system works, people have basically been expected to deal with all of these problems on their own. They've had to kind of work harder, take on more shifts, maybe even take out debt just to make ends meet. And that's really a kind of a product of this crushing of collective power and the shift towards individualism, which is designed to make us think really that we are completely and utterly alone. So this is why we all feel so powerless, because we've got this kind of, really powerful, broad, deep, expansive coalition of corporate, financial, political power, where big businesses, financial institutions, governments are all working together basically to protect their own interests. And then they've all spent their time convincing us that we're these isolated, atomized individuals who need to be competing with one another rather than cooperating, like the workers at Lucas Aerospace, for example. So dealing with that sense of powerlessness means that the labor movement has to take a really, really significant role in not just advocating for individual workers on a daily basis. Obviously, that's so important. That's the bread and butter of the labor movement. That's what unions need to be doing every day. But the big thing is how joining a union can push back against that sense of individualism that dominates so many people's lives and give them a sense of their own power, give them a sense of the way that the system works, of the kind of interests that are aligned against them, and then a sense of how organizing with people who are like them, with their class, with their co-workers, can actually help them to fight back against that. And I think there are some really exciting examples of unions that are doing this today all around the world. I've just written an article about the Workers' Party in Belgium, which is organizing with unions and with communities to basically kind of elevate class consciousness and really fight back against the far right by combating this sense of individualism. They have things like medics for the people, which are doctors that are in local communities. And when workers come to them and say, I've got a problem with my back because I've been working at the docks all day, they treat them and support them and then say, by the way, this is because of your working conditions. Have you considered how you could kind of come together with other people and like start fighting that? And they've actually helped people to organize to improve their working conditions as a result of coming together through that model. Also, I've been doing some work recently with someone at a team at the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, who have been organizing a program of political education with the Bakers Union, basically getting ordinary workers who are in Greggs, who are in, various different shops all across the country, bringing them to a couple of days of workshops, basically saying, we're going to learn about how capitalism works, and we're going to learn about why organizing is so important as a way to tackle that. And the way in which that's helped people achieve a sense of self-confidence, empowerment, and then go back to their workplaces and actually fight so much harder has been really, really significant. So yeah, I guess my message today is just to say, the big challenge for the labor movement, as well as all of the challenges that we already know exist, fighting kind of years of decline, the anti-union laws, just a very unequal economy. It has to center on how we can create a sense of empowerment for people, fight back against this like atomization, this kind of divide and rule strategy that encourages us to believe that we're all alone, and really rebuild that sense of collective power, not just kind of in institutions, but in people's hearts and minds as well. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Grace. That was an incredible whistle-stop tour through neoliberalism and capitalism. and workers' rights as well. That was amazing. Thank you so much for that. And I think it's a great pitch for everyone to go and buy Grace's book as well, if you want more. Or get your questions ready for a little bit later, after we've heard from Zack, who I'm going to hand over to now, because he doesn't need any introduction as our deputy leader. And I don't think I could do one justice either. So I'm going to hand over to Zack.
Thanks, Jane, and thanks, Grace. That was awesome as always. I feel when Grace talks, it's a bit like when you've seen a magic trick and then someone explains how it happens afterwards from behind the scenes. And vulture capitalism is very much like that, the way that Grace kind of joins the dots of lots of different things that are going on in our society in a really clear way that feels quite obvious once you said it, but there's millions of people in this country who it's not obvious to. So it's always great to have brilliant communicators saying this is what's happening on our watch, and this is how inequality is widening and neoliberalism is kind of pervading through all of our lives. I'm going to be brief actually, because then we can get on to questions. I guess I just want to tell a quick story really, and it jumps nicely off what Grace just talked about and in the book, Vulture Capitalism and the role of trade unions too. So one of the first trade unions I got involved with as an elected politician, this was with Matthew Hull, who's on the call, was United Voices of the World. This is a group of migrant workers based in London who are campaigning often for pay, but just as importantly, dignity, working conditions. And Matthew first introduced me to them when it was a group of care workers who weren't being paid properly during the pandemic. So whilst the people they were looking after, or many of us, were kind of living our lives in the city, being kept safe, these migrant workers were out every day, keeping people safe and alive. And when they complained about their wages and working conditions, the CEO, and by the way, this was a billionaire, rewarded them with pizza as a thank you for their work. And in fact, as they told me, it wasn't just pizza, it was cold pizza at that. Anyway, this story could go much longer, but we campaigned on it. And now those care workers are among the highest paid care workers in London. And that's because organising works, campaigning works. Now, that same union, United Voice of the Workers, are currently on strike with a group of security guards at the Natural History Museum and the Science Museum. I've been out on the picket line with them. It very much looked like the museums were ignoring them. They've built in size, they've turned up, they've organised, and just today, negotiations have now begun improper. And so, again, this isn't one to celebrate yet because there's still a long way to go to get them the demands that they're asking for. But it's just another example of how getting behind these campaigns is ultimately the antidote to big government and kind of mainstream media who often ignore these stories, but actually groups of people on the ground saying, this is my daily experience, this is what I'm going through, and I'm asking you for solidarity. And I'm always really pleased to see Green Party members out on picket lines supporting people in their local area. I know especially people who are in London on this call, so thank you for doing all of that. Now, the reason why I picked that particular picket line on purpose is because the last time I was on the picket line, it was the same day as a Stand Up to Racism rally that was happening in central London as a antidote to Tommy Robinson's rally. So we went on the picket line with those workers, then we all marched together to the Stand Up to Racism rally. And it was really just a kind of concrete metaphor of standing up for workers' rights, walking along and chanting, talking about the far right and their kind of experiences as migrant workers and people of colour living in London or living in Britain, their worries, their fears, seeing what's been going on our streets, literally the racist riots we've had on our streets, and then coming together at the Stand Up to Racism rally where Extinction Rebellion, Stop the War, Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, Greenpeace, the Green Party, where we all came together in a kind of movements of saying, very fond of saying this, but that's because it's true, there's no environmental justice without social, racial and economic justice too. And joining all of those things together and recognizing that this is everyone's fight. And ultimately, if we look at the climate crisis, London has just gone through a resilience review looking at what the future looks like. As we face warming temperatures. And again, unions were on strike this year with a heat strike, ultimately saying heat in the workplace is becoming more and more excessive, and there just aren't plans to get there. Now, this is something that will affect everyone who works in a workplace, but it'll affect some jobs more than others, people who work outside or people who work in workplaces that aren't as nice workplaces. And this is frequently more working class workplaces. So although it will affect us all, it will affect people unequally. And again, it's just inequality running out throughout these things again. So as I said, I'm going to wrap up quick there. But I think ultimately it's about joining these dots. And I think in terms of the Green Party's space in this, I think it's people recognizing, there are lots of us on this Zoom call, but there should be so many more of us on this Zoom call. And I'd say we need to be reaching out to other people in the Green Party who, if this was a nature Zoom call or a climate Zoom call, would be in even bigger numbers, and actually making people realize that whether you care about nature or climate, and those are really important things to care about, that I care about too, that ultimately people are at the heart of that. And whilst we're protecting the planet, we need to be protecting people too. And I think it's about constantly having these conversations with interested ears to grow our movement, to grow these campaigns, and to make sure that the trade union movement more broadly know that we're on their side and we're out there campaigning for a £15 minimum wage, to make sure that we're campaigning for workers' rights in the workplace, that we're campaigning to remove those anti-strike laws that Grace was talking about. And ultimately, the Green Party has to be at the heart of that. So thanks very much for being here this evening, and we are looking forward to your questions. I say we, maybe Grace isn't looking forward to it, but I imagine she is.
Hopefully everyone's looking forward to questions.
Exactly.
Amazing. Thank you, Zach. And yeah, I think the IWGB is definitely one of the unions that comes to mind when we think of those unions that Grace was talking about, in terms of that are doing that political education work alongside kind of that organizing of workers as well. They're definitely a really good example of that. And it's really inspiring to see everyone out on the picket lines. And for everyone who doesn't know, Matthew, who is here, is our trade union liaison officer for the Green Party. So he sits on the National Green Party Executive and also on our Green Party Trade Union Group Committee as well. Okay, so we are going to move on and get some questions. So I haven't had any in the chat. But if anyone has a question that they'd like to put to Grace or Zach or both of them, feel free to pop your hand up and then we will come to you. I'll give a minute for some hands. Oh, lots of hands. Okay. Ed, we'll start with you. I might just take a couple at once, and then Zach and Grace, I'll come back to you both. So we'll go with Ed first and then Matthew.
Okay, hi. I guess my question is really for anybody who might have some tips. I'm a member of Unison in Hertfordshire, and my experiences of trade union meetings in Unison in Hertfordshire it's very dormant. It's kind of dominated by bureaucrats of a particular party loyalty, a particular faction of that party. And I find getting anything beyond the kind of most basic stuff done is almost impossible to achieve. So how do we, given that the trade union movement's quite long in the tooth now, and there's quite an entrenched bureaucracy in a lot of unions, particularly unions like Unison, how do we kind of reinvigorate those things, particularly when we're coming from a party that is perhaps those unions aren't sympathetic to?
Oh, great question, Ed. Question after my own heart as a fellow Unison member who definitely struggles with that. Matthew?
Thanks very much, Jane. Thanks both for speaking. I think it came out really strongly in your comments that for the left and for the Green Party, I suppose in particular, presenting an anti-systemic offer to the public is going to be especially important if we're not to fall into some of the traps that Grace laid out so clearly. So I was wondering whether you have any thoughts, I suppose, about some of those traps in particular, but maybe some of the ways that we can avoid that. Whether there's any more you can say about, what it would mean for us to present a sort of left anti-systemic offer to the public. We are in Parliament in greater numbers than we have been. It's still a small party, but every left and socialist party, I think, faces like pretty strong headwinds and pretty strong impulses, urging them to conform with what's already come before, whether it's us now or the Labour Party in the 1920s and onwards. So I'm interested in any thoughts you might have around that.
Amazing. Thanks, Matthew. Grace, Zach, either of you want to go first?
Yeah, I'm happy to.
Cool.
So yeah, great questions. I very much sympathize with having to sit in very boring branch meetings. Yeah, I'm not going to tell you that there's an easy solution to this, but I do think there are things that as members you can suggest and try to take forward that can, as you say, try and kind of reinvigorate the union and maybe get people more involved, and also get some political education done. So I think the political education is potentially a really good way to talk about this, because it's something that you can suggest that doesn't seem too radical, that isn't going to tread on too many people's toes, but which can really actually give people a sense of the value of joining a union. And the program I was talking about, which is run by the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung, which is basically associated with the Left Party in Germany, but runs trade union stuff all over the world, really. They've developed a model based on Organize Now, which was something that was done in the US. And it's basically saying, you know, when we're kind of getting people into the labor movement, we don't just want to be, you know, having them have procedural discussions and talking to them about, you know, paying conditions, as important as all those things are. We also want to help them to have this kind of broader understanding of capitalism and their role within the system as workers. So this particular like model runs for several weeks and brings in a bunch of union organizers and leaders and, you know, just general people who are interested, to give them that kind of education and to, yeah, kind of help them to understand how their organizing plays into that wider kind of anti-capitalist struggle, I guess. And then also, obviously, alongside that, all of the kind of strategic and other tools that you need to kind of do effective organizing. But it's really more focused on like giving people an understanding of capitalism to make them feel empowered when they're doing that organizing. So they're not just sat there thinking, oh yeah, I'm just, you know, trying to get a 5% pay increase, as important as that would be. They're also thinking, I'm part of this bigger movement, which is about actually holding the powerful to account and strengthening the role of workers within society. So something like that, I think, would be really positive. And I can send you the information of the people who are organizing that, if that is something that you would want to suggest. And there are obviously all sorts of other things that you could suggest as well. So the other question was, yeah, how to present a kind of left anti-systemic offer. I really think that, you know, that has to focus around, yeah, kind of like building popular power. And popular power also not just thinking about like, okay, how do we build social movements? That's important. But, you know, we're here talking about trade unions. There has to be also a focus and understanding on building class power, right? Which is maybe something that you would ordinarily, as Green Party members, think is associated with the Labour Party. Definitely isn't associated with the Labour Party anymore. But I think there is a really big gap there now as Greens to be able to say we want to build class power, because working people are the only ones who have the real incentive to actually oppose climate breakdown, because the people who are benefiting from this system are massive fossil fuel executives and, you know, basically powerful elites who benefit from us continuing as we are. And the ones who are going to suffer from it are all of the rest of us, you know. And yes, that is going to look unequal when it comes to the global economy. But even if we think about the UK, you know, flooding, the potential breakdown of AMOC, of like Gulf Stream currents, that's going to profoundly change the way our society works. It's going to be working people who are going to have to deal with that. So I think an awareness and an analysis of class would be really, really beneficial as part of that broader kind of anti-capitalist narrative that the Greens do really well.
Amazing. Thanks, Grace. And I think some great tips there on where we can start. I'm sure Zack has also got lots of thoughts, so I'm going to hand over to him.
Yeah, so on the first one, I think the first thing to say is that I go around the country and on media always talking about people should join a trade union. Trade unions are great, and that is all true. And at the same time, they are imperfect, because any organisations are imperfect. And I've had occasions where, obviously for obvious reasons I won't name and shame now, but I've met workers who have complained about an institution that they're working in, and then I've said, have you spoken to your trade union? And they've said that my trade unionist or representative is part of the problem because they're one of my managers. So I think there's a whole piece there around transparency and accountability, and that's not just in trade unions, that's in any organisation. And ultimately that is, again, about building worker power from within the union. So it's not for me as an elected politician or deputy leader of the Green Party to tell unions how to run their businesses. So I'm just, or businesses is probably the wrong word there, organisations. But ultimately, I'm answering the question asked. And so I think it's about building up that worker power. I think Greens organised within the Green Party are doing a really interesting model there, which is working within the party, working constructively within a party, but saying what does a better or more effective or improved version look like, and then demonstrating change, which can then be taken on board. And I think versions of that within trade union movements, where people get together to go, actually, we really support the work of the movement, we support the trade union, we just think these things could be better, and we're going to organise to make that happen. And then ideally to get people elected into positions to make those things happen feels like that's probably the way to do that grassroots work from within. I think the second question, I think part one of the answer again is Greens Organise. For those on the call who don't know what this is, the Greens Organise is a group within the party that have started to organise independently of the leadership and our elected MPs to look at bold positions, effective positions that the party could be campaigning on and kind of amplify those positions. I think that kind of work is going to be crucial as time passes, because I think we always need to be bolder as a party, and we have a moral obligation to be bolder as a party. Naomi Klein recently has been talking about eco-populism, and I think this frame is really, really important because actually, if we don't do eco-populism, very weirdly, Nigel Farage is going to do anti-eco-populism. In fact, he's already started it. And what I mean by this is he's going to essentially start or continue to talk to working class disaffected voters, even voters of color, as we've seen Donald Trump do in America, and speak to their issues. Now, obviously, the solutions that both Nigel Farage and Donald Trump present are completely antithetical to the solutions that we need, but they are very effective storytellers and very effective communicators. They're playing politics on easy mode in some ways, because when they tell a story, it does not have to be true. In fact, they prefer it when it isn't true and it isn't backed by data. On the left, when we tell stories, we've both got to tell a story that hits with the gut and in the heart, and it's got to be true and objectively backed by evidence. We're really good in the Green Party, I think, with the evidence and the data, and we have reams and reams of policy, and we can always be better on that, but I think we've pretty much got that ticked. I think what we can improve as a party is our storytelling, our effective communication and messaging. So we're really making sure that we're speaking to lots of voters who are not even voting yet, or are voting for the Labour Party because they think there is no other alternative. And just to link the two questions together, I think, if I look at the Fire Brigade Union, Matt Rack, complicated character, because on one hand he's speaking absolutely brilliantly on the climate crisis, on the need for the fire brigade to step up on adaptation and resilience, and really speaking to the urgency of that for working class people and how this will hit them. But at the same time, this kind of implicit, or I think even explicit endorsement at times of Keir Starmer, a man who rolled back from his flagship climate pledge that wasn't even enough in the first place, and then seems determined to put pressure again in London on Sadiq Khan to roll back from his climate policies too. So I think we've got a real important moral obligation in the Green Party to present both the climate case, yes, but exactly as Grace just said, the class case for inequality and building up that power to essentially speak to whole swathes of people, in fact, the majority in this country, to coin a phrase that we have the many, not the few, and to bring people together to ultimately build up that narrative with our Green Party policies that have been there for a long time to effectively build up. And I think that's how we both grow power in terms of more MPs, but also that's how we change the conversation as well nationally.
Fantastic. Thank you, Zach. Okay, I'm going to go to some more questions because I'm aware we are running out of time. I did also just want to encourage anyone who is a woman on our binary who wants to ask a question. You would be very much encouraged, because I'm aware that this room is quite heavily balanced towards men at the moment. So just to encourage everyone, if you would like to ask a question, please do so. Paul, and then I'm going to come to Ken.
Yeah, hi. I guess I've got a question about what you'd like to see maybe leaders in the trade union movement saying to the Labour government, as in theory they still have some influence on them. And I'm sort of, I guess I'm directing that at you, Grace, a little bit, and thinking about, how would you like union leaders to be pressuring the government into moving into positions which are a little bit more in keeping with some of your ideas in your book? Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Ken? Oh, Ken, I'm not sure that we can hear you. We still can't hear you, I'm afraid. If you want to type it into the chat, I'm more than happy to read it out. Okay, I think Ken is typing into the chat, so I'm going to go to Roy. next?
Yeah, two points really. The point that Grace raised about uh, the role of the state, I think you can see that now with Grenfell, actually, where they're kicking it into the long grass. And the problem is that that's the history of these sort of scandals where the people responsible for it end up not going to jail basically, and instead it pitches out as an issue. And I could think, and if you look at history, there's so many cases of that. The other point I want to raise as a Unite community member is what uh, the GMB played a really important role in organising on the floor with Amazon workers in Coventry, including supporting building of support groups. And I think that's really encouraging because trade unions that's where they need to go, really. They need to start pioneering the old way of organising back in the 20s if we're going to go forward as a class. Um, and if whoever writes a book on Amazon should be out soon, hopefully. There's so many lessons in there for talking to workers from different ethnicities, etc. And I think that's the way you build the class. If they can build in Amazon, we can build anywhere.
Yeah, thanks, Roy. I've also had one through in the chat, which I think is sort of connected to what Roy was just talking about with Amazon. So I'm just going to read it out. Grace, it's primarily directed at you. How do you think we can overcome individualism in ununionized workplaces? For instance, coffee, where you have a lot of graduate middle class people who are paid peanuts but would rather switch jobs than unionize. So Grace, Zach, whoever would like to go first, and then Ken and Alan will try and get to you both as well.
Sure, I'm happy to come back in. Because I'll go for that last question first. How can we kind of combat individualism in non or less unionized workplaces? Now, there are a lot of these today, particularly when we think about hospitality, various parts of the service sector, also the gig economy. This is massive. In some ways, the reason that we got the gig economy to begin with was part of this project to convince workers that they're not actually workers. They're kind of individual micro enterprises or entrepreneurs. So they should be competing with one another instead of cooperating. And really, I think that's the big challenge in all of these places. It is to kind of cut through that ideology that we are so bombarded with everywhere, which is, it's up to you to compete, to hustle, to push people out of the way to get to the top. And really re-emphasize the value of cooperation. I think once you actually start talking to people about those things, about individualism and about kind of the potential power of organizing, it's not a very kind of deep rooted commitment, I don't think. I think most people kind of just believe a lot of the things that we're taught as a result of individualism by default. I don't think that it's kind of core to what most of us know about the world, which is that actually that we do have to cooperate to survive, that cooperation is just as much a part of our lives as competition. So having those conversations can have a really, really big impact, which is why, having a few good organizers in those harder to organize sectors can make such a difference. And indeed it has. So, look at, for example, what the Bakers Union has been doing in organizing workers in, Greggs, there's been the Ginsters organising effort, which has been taking place for a while now. Those are very, very precarious workers from lots of different parts of the world, and the Bakers Union has been organising them really effectively. Look at what a number of organisers from across a bunch of different unions did in Deliveroo, for example. Callum Cant's written a really interesting book called Riding for Deliveroo about how Deliveroo workers started to get organised. We've already heard about the fantastic example of Amazon. So the workers at Amazon warehouses pushing to get union recognition, and also the Make Amazon Pay campaign, which some of you might have seen, that has brought together Amazon workers from all over the world to strike basically on the same day. So, we have this idea that these places are just hard to organize. And in some ways they are, because, as you say, people come and go. But if you have effective unions and like really committed organizers, then it's not hard to convince people that they are actually better off joining the union and participating in these things, not just because it's going to give them more pay, but also because, a lot of people feel kind of lonely, isolated, scared, and they want that sense of belonging that comes with participating in a collective movement. The other question was, how can we put pressure on the Labour Party? Well, I mean, I like to see that as my kind of 24/7 job at the moment. No, I mean, I think like after the election, I was, in some ways really pleased, because when it comes to, actually forcing Labour to the left, I think having Greens in Parliament is so, so important, just to be able to present an alternative narrative. But also, I mean, when we think about the way that those campaigns played out, so for all of the Green candidates, but also for some of the independent candidates who were elected in some places where there was a lot of support for, a lot of opposition to the Gaza genocide, that was all built on community organizing and, really kind of deep-rooted local campaigning that brought people together, pushed back against this massive wider trend. None of these seats were predicted in most of the opinion polls, because they were looking at national trends. They weren't looking at this really powerful community organizing that was taking place at the grassroots. And that was ultimately what won the day. So, I'm all for, I think it is really important for us to have, people in positions of power, people in the media, people in Parliament, who are all, making the arguments that need to be made. But the foundation for that power is and always has to be community organizing, labor organizing, our participation in movements, getting out there on the streets, and basically making politicians know that we're not going to just let them get away with the things that they've been able to get away with for a very long time up to now. I like to say that politicians should be as scared of the people who vote for them as they are of the ones who write the checks.
Oh, I love that, Grace. That's excellent. That's such a good way to look at it. Okay, I'm gonna hand over to Zack.
Thank you. I won't add a lot there because Grace has smashed that. I suppose it's a moment as well to thank Grace, that Grace was one of the first kind of big names on the left who said, I'm voting Green at the last election. And now lots of people have done that and said that. So it's great and still appreciate. Actually, I think it was a brave step first, because you're kind of stepping out heterodoxy of saying, I'm on the left and I'm voting Green. So thank you very much, Grace, for your support there. What do I want trade union leaders to do? I guess endorse the Green Party. But joking aside from that, I think there's a moment where the current situation is unsustainable, because we know that there are plenty of trade unions who are unhappy with the Labour Party. In fact, they're very vocal about it frequently. And sometimes they are mocked gently with the idea that they're going to send another strongly worded letter to this Labour government. Now, as unhappy as I am with this Labour government, you often hear the shout back of, they've only been around 6-7 months. And on most days, I'd argue with that. I'd say they've only been around 6-7 months, but enough to utterly destroy or to create further problems and to demonstrate very clearly what their values are. But I do get, for most members of the public who aren't thinking about politics all the time, they're still in the period where they're just glad to be rid of the Tories. And I think there's some legitimacy to that, even if I don't share that position. But that can only last for so long. And I think as living standards don't increase, as people don't see their wages go up, as they see working conditions get even worse, and the increasing alienation or loneliness or individualism that Grace was just talking about so articulately there, I think that's only going to get worse, because we know that Starmer's Labour government are not going to tackle the material conditions or the philosophical conditions even that are creating these things to happen if you don't take on corporate invested interests. And in fact, if you tweet out that BlackRock are absolutely essential to your growth mission, which cannot succeed anyway, even if you didn't use BlackRock, it's the wrong measure to go on, then things can only get worse. And I think that's only sustainable for trade unions for so long before their workers within the trade unions go, hey, we're not happy with this government and we're not happy giving our money to this government. And I think rather than see that as an opportunity to jump on, I think we need to be building those long-term relationships now and be that consistent message, be that consistent party that's been pushing the Labour Party to the left, or trying to push the Labour Party to the left. And even if we don't succeed in pushing them to the left, and by the way, I think on some things we already are, I think even on Gaza, they'd be even in a worse position than they are if we, along with, yes, to be fair, independent voices as well, hadn't been pushing them. I think the situation would be even worse. So I think it's that kind of incremental change, but being ready to make those bigger changes. I see Ken's put a question in the chat. It's just a side note to thank Ken for the work that he's been doing in Splot. There's a by-election this Thursday in Cardiff. It's a local by-election, but actually it's really important because Reform are gaining ground in Wales, and I think it's just a real key example of we are really on track to get our first seat in the Senedd, the first Green seat in the Senedd, and I think it's vital where we're seeing Reform rise in Wales that we need to see the Green Party rise in Wales too, because it's just an example of everything we've been talking about tonight, where working class voices and people who are in unions and working hard need to see that representation, and it can't come from Reform. To answer your question though, I'm going to widen it out. Grace might have something more specific on it, but I think this is an example of exactly why we need public sector investment. Not just because public sector investment is desirable anyway in the exact way that we should be foregrounding tackling the climate crisis, but ultimately it's an opportunity to demonstrate better too. So if you take our flagship policy of insulating every single home in Britain that needs it, that would reduce emissions, it would reduce people's bills, vital in the cost of living crisis. But the other key bit too is it would create those good green jobs. And when I say those green jobs in the public sector can make sure that they have decent working conditions, decent pay, and decent grassroots democratic organising power within them from the very beginning. So I think the more as a party and the more as a society we can push for public sector, big investment, big infrastructure, big projects, ultimately we need to make sure baked into those in the terms of reference from the very beginning is worker power, because we're demonstrating an alternative model that we won't come from the private sector, because other than a few exceptions where people's morality or heart kind of cuts above the profit line or the bottom line motive, we know that that's just not going to happen. And it's a bit about, people insist that renewables are going to happen in the private sector because renewables are cheaper than electricity. But if there is no profit motive for them there, then they are not going to invest. So ultimately, we need the public sector here. And within that, we need that worker power too.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Zach. So I think we've just about run out of time almost. So Zach, Grace, don't know if either of you have got any final comments that you wanted to make.
I'll go, so then I give Grace the final word. I just wanted to send solidarity to Gabe and the NEU who are striking tomorrow and Thursday. I'm sorry I'm not on a picket line after talking about how much I'm on picket lines, but I am in the chamber voting both days, so I hope you'll understand. But if anyone on this call can make a picket line or show solidarity on social media, which I certainly will be doing, then please do. And thank you very much for coming here tonight, and thank you, Grace, for being with us too. But I'll hand it over to Grace for the last word.
Yeah, just to say again, thanks so much for all being here, and thanks for all the incredible work that you do. It's often a bit of a thankless task being an organizer, but it is just the foundation of all of the big, exciting policy changes that we talk about. Any change that we want to see, whether it's regarding the climate, the economy, anything, the only way it's going to happen is if we're able to build popular power. And that requires people like all of you guys to take on positions of leadership in workplaces and communities and in political parties. So I'm always so joyful to see that people are stepping up and doing that. And also just to say, on that campaign in Wales, on the NEU campaign, please do come to me if you want support on social media, if you want me to post things, if you want me to kind of try and support getting the vote out or getting people onto picket lines. I'm very, very happy to do that, because I'm not always across everything, but I'm very happy to help where I can. I see Zach's reacting to that favorably.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Grace, and thank you for all the support that you've given to the party as well. And I've put Strike Map in the chat for anybody who is inspired and wants to get to a picket line tomorrow. Please do that. It would be great to see lots of photos. And if you do go, please do tag the Green Party Trade Union Group in your photos, and then we can share them as well. So I am going to hand over back to Robert for a quick roundup of what the Green Party Trade Union Group has been up to.
Brill. Thank you so much, Grace. Thank you, Zach. Great. Okay, I know we said 7:30 to 8:30, but I'm gonna try and keep everyone on for a little bit just so I can run through I'll quickly summarize the annual report. I'll just share my screen. I've put the link in the chat. So please do go and read it. But just can everyone see that? Now see me and then a slide. Yes, cool. Yeah, so please do have a look at it. Keen to hear people's ideas. So have a look and see if there's anything missing that you think, like, why is the Green Party Trade Union Group not doing this? Anything that you think would be great if we could do more of. But yeah, the highlights from the last year, a big focus in the first half of the year was manifesto input in the lead up to the general election. So working with Matthew as the national trade union liaison on the executive, we had a lot of input into that. And successfully, I had what I think we can safely say is the strongest manifesto yet on workers' rights, which was really great to have. We produced a briefing for candidates, for all the parliamentary candidates that went out, and we ran a rally for workers, just to platform the great positions that we had. And of course, we wouldn't have had that manifesto policy if we hadn't passed great policy over the years, over the decades, but particularly in the last few years, there are some great policies passed at conference. So it just shows the value of engaging in the conference policy process, both in the lead up to it, in the prioritization ballots and so on, and then at conference itself to get those votes over the line. So well done to everyone who was involved with that. We've run our sort of regular events. So we had one at conference where we had councillors talking about how to push back on continued austerity in councils, how to work with trade unions to do that. That was a really interesting event and led to us producing a briefing with the Association for Green Councillors. And we're hoping to get that on our website soon and would really welcome feedback on that. We had another event quite recently on worker-led transitions with Unite and TUC and Platform. And I've got another one planned for the new year on agriculture work, which I think should be really interesting. Lots of good speakers that have responded. So we've got the Land Workers Alliance have said that they'll come and speak, and there's a new union called SALT, which is Solidarity Across Land Trades, which is really interesting. New union sitting under the Bakers Union. And obviously in the context of Labour and the inheritance tax drama and farmers protesting, this is an area, and like the strength of Greens in rural areas, this is somewhere that we could really pay more attention to as a party. We have had lots of engagement with the leadership earlier in the year, facilitating meetings with general secretaries, which a few of those happened. And then Matthew's been working with Ellie, particularly in Parliament, since being elected on the Employment Rights Bill. We've been continuing work to try and get more trade union liaisons in regional and local parties. That's the best way, I think, for us to get members across the Green Party activated to get out on picket lines, is if they have their regional party and their local party talking about this stuff, campaigning on trade union issues and encouraging members to go out onto the picket line and to support strikes in their area. So we'd really, really encourage people, if you haven't already considered it, or if you think you might be interested in being a trade union liaison for your local or regional party, please do look into it, get in touch if you're interested. And we now have a toolkit on our website for trade union liaison officers, or TULOs. So you can go and look at that. It's on the About section of the website. But we're also going to be contacting regional party coordinators to try and get them to make sure that they keep those positions open. Most of the time when I contact a regional coordinator, they're up for having someone, they're up for co-opting someone. So I spoke to the Eastern region coordinator recently, and they're up for having someone co-opted into the role. They just need people to stand up and take them on. So please do consider doing that. Yeah, I mentioned the AGC joint briefing that we've done, so we're going to share that around. If you're a councillor, if you've got a WhatsApp group with local councillors, please do pass that on to them. Make sure that they've seen it. It should be helpful for them to know who to speak to in trade unions, in the council, and in their community generally. We have a WhatsApp group for councillors. So if you're a councillor yourself, please make sure that you're in that. So that's really helpful for sharing anything trade union related for councillors. And then finally, we got the policy working groups up and running. So they're sort of running jointly at the moment. So that's the Workers' Rights and Employment Policy Working Group, and then the Industry and Jobs Policy Working Group. And those being active, like I said, will just really help promote the policies that typically the GPTUs stepped in to try and advance through conference. So those groups being set up independently will should really help with that and take the pressure off GPT a bit, although obviously we'll still be interested and we'll want to support those. But yeah, if you're particularly interested in policy, yeah, please do join those policy working groups. The next meeting for those will be actually part of Policy Fest. So in January, 12th of January, there's a meeting of the policy working groups. And yeah, and then finally, I should just say the committee election, sorry that that's been a little bit delayed. The ERO hopefully is going to be sending out an email very soon, imminently. So yeah, thank you to the people who put themselves forward for the committee for next year. Okay. Thanks for listening to all of that, but keen to hear any thoughts. I don't want to keep people for a long time, so maybe like we can keep this for 10 minutes or so, 15 minutes even, depends if people have questions or thoughts. But yeah, I'd be really interested to hear people's thoughts on that and whether anyone has any suggestions of what GPTU should be doing more of. Rowan.
Hi, I just wanted to say hi and thank you so much for all the work that you're doing, and to say that I am the Green Party Regional Council trade union liaison. So if anybody ever has anything that they want to talk to the Green Party Regional Council about, then I am that person that you need to talk to. My email is on the website. It's rowan.mclaughlin at one of those things. But yeah, please do. Here I am, and I'm here to be useful.
Thanks, Rowan. That's really helpful. Appreciate it a lot. And yeah, I should also use this chance to thank the committee for from this year. So Jane, Peter Murray, Sue Tibbles, Alex Powell, and then Matthew, who's as trade union liaison on the executive. So yeah, big thanks to everyone. Here's a question in the chat. How can GPTU get a Tulo for London, which currently does not have a Tulo post? Is there anyone from London on the call who would be willing to become the trade union liaison officer? We could do it right now. No, I mean we need a volunteer. We need to encourage people that it's a doable role. I think one idea that we could do as GPTU is we have members, we know where all the regions where all of our members are. So we can target an email to members in that region from GPTU. But I think first what I want to do is make sure that the coordinator is definitely open to having someone co-opted onto the committee. So that's the plan. So we will contact the coordinators, make sure that the check if coordinators are up for having someone co-opted. And then once they are, what we can do is email all the GPTU members in London, for example, and say, this is open for co-option. Here's your toolkit. Explain what the role involves. I think some of the mystery around the role up until now makes it maybe a little bit more difficult for people to take on, but also the fact that it might be seen as a distraction from elections work. And I think all of us here should be going back to local parties, making the case for trade union liaisons and trade union engagement work generally being a massive benefit to our election work. The two work in tandem. The more that we're out on picket lines, the more that we can, I for my local party, we had a story go up on the Haringey Green Party website the other day of supporting strike action for Unite housing repair workers in the council. So the more that we can do that stuff, the more that we're showing visibly, exactly as Grace said, that we're out there supporting working people. And we can challenge some of those ideas about what the Green Party is, and more importantly, show to people in the community what we're about and that we have their back. So that's the case I think we should be making in all of our local parties, is that this work is essential to our political and electoral work. It's not separate from it. Just reading Sue's message. Great. Steve Williams and Rick Fricker were elected as Southeast tutors in a job share. Brilliant. Question on affiliation. We try to we haven't put that question to any unions explicitly. I think we've got trust to build up with the unaffiliated unions. We do have a relationship with a number of them. Like for example, the Bakers Union, we have a close relationship with NEU, always comes to conference. We have those relationships. But I think we need to continue to build that trust before we can start to think about affiliation. We'd love to see it happen, of course. But we need to strengthen the relationship between trade unions and the Green Party at all levels. And I think our job is to keep doing that. But Alan, feel free to stick your hand up and come in if you've got thoughts on that. Tom, I missed the start. Was anything said on asking new members whether they're a member of union? It's a great question, Tom. We did contact the party about that previously. They're understandably quite sensitive about the amount of things you ask, the amount of bits of information you ask new members for. But we think it would be a real plus if people could have that information asked of them at the outset. So it maybe something we can push for again. Maybe we just need to keep banging on that door. But yeah, would be very keen to see that happen. Matthew, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I was just going to say very quickly, I think that's been a very popular ask, and it's a very obvious one. It's really critical information about people's sort of political action and identity, and we should absolutely be collecting it. I think it underscores the importance of building these things into the party's strategy overall, because staff members are, quite rightly not looking to take sort of one-off instructions from individual members of the party, even individual members of the party's executive committee, and that's totally understandable. They've got work plans they need to work within. So I think the key is to sort of ensure that building that kind of I suppose data about our members and building those sort of relationships with union rank and file is actually part of the party strategy, and that has a real purchase on those work plans when they're made.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I should also say actually we've had contact from a staff member who's responsible for constituency targeting for the next general election, and that process is already underway. And one of the things that we would like to do is to make sure that trade union membership of candidates is taken into account as again as part of the very basic data collection of candidates. Let's just be noting, is someone a trade union member, and factor that in so that we're considering making sure that we take that consideration. And you want to have a slate of candidates going into the next election who are all as engaged, if not more so, than their Labour competitors for their seats in trade unions. So that would be really good to see. And again, it's just a reminder for people who are thinking of standing as a candidate that you really should be a member of a trade union, and supporting them in your constituency. Agreed on the Senate. Yeah. Great. Any final questions? Okay. I think we'll finish there then. Great to see everyone. Thank you very much for your time. As I said, Policy Fest in January, on the 12th of January, for the policy working groups. If you're interested in those, look out for your voting email. And yeah, final thanks to Grace and for Zach for coming along to speak, and to Jane for running the session. Thanks all. Cheerio.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.